ready to go deep. This time we're tackling why some nations seem to make it, while others struggle even when they're aiming for the same things.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is we're looking at a really specific case study this time, Afghanistan.
Exactly. We're diving into this book by Chinese author Guo Jianlong. The book's title in Chinese is Yuji, which translates to The Lost World, Traps and Lessons in the Development of Emerging Countries. To kick things off, we've got the story of Zahir, a rug merchant from Kabul. He's 86 years old.
His story is like Afghanistan in a nutshell. Like, he remembers when Kabul was vibrant, even like westernized in many ways, and like miniskirts, tourists everywhere, and his own business booming. Now under the Taliban, all gone.
Makes you think, right?
Yeah.
To figure out what went wrong, the author gives us these 4 areas, these pillars that developing countries need to nail if they want to modernize.
Yeah, 4 pillars of progress, like a checklist. First, you've got economic development, not just the country getting richer. The wealth has to reach the people.
Right.
Then there's political freedom. Got to have systems that are stable and fair for everyone.
Makes sense.
What else?
The third one, people forget this one, but it's so important. Social modernization and secularization. It's about a society shifting its values, its norms, to embrace progress. Think women's rights, access to education. Huge.
And to round it out, you need international recognition. It's like trying to join a club, a really exclusive one, and the existing members, they get to decide if you're in or out.
Great analogy. And this framework, it's super helpful as we go through Afghanistan's history because we can see where things went right or really wrong.
Let's rewind to the early 1900s. When King Amanullah Khan was in charge, he was all about reforms, looking to the West to modernize.
And that's where we see this tension pop up, tradition versus reform. Can make or break a nation. One example, the Queen. She removes her veil publicly.
Wow. Risky move.
Total statement for change, right. But it triggered a huge backlash. So Amanullah Khan's reforms didn't stick. He was forced out. It's like even good intentions can backfire if you don't get that balance right between progress and tradition. But then things got interesting in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, under King Zahir Shah and Prime Minister, later President Mohammed Daoud Khan. Relatively peaceful. Prosperous. Remember the hippie trail? Kabul was a stop. Tourists. Businesses doing well, progress in education and women's rights.
A golden age, kind of. So what happened? Why didn't it last?
This is where it gets complicated. Afghanistan's modernization, it was modeled after the West. They looked to the West for support. But when they really needed it, the West turned its back.
Are you serious? Why?
Major conflict brewing with Pakistan. Over Pashtun territories, access to the sea. The West, especially the U.S., sided with Pakistan. Imagine feeling betrayed. You embrace these ideals, then you're abandoned when you need help.
Yeah, that would breed some resentment.
Total void. And you know who was ready to step in? The Soviet Union.
Ah, so that's how they get involved.
Exactly. Feeling isolated, Afghanistan turns to the Soviets for backing. Economic, political, big consequences, good and bad. They got the aid they needed, but also got tangled up in the Cold War. Remember those radical leftist student movements? Part of that was fueled by this disillusionment with the West.
So the seeds of conflict were already there.
And within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, huge leftist force, there's this power struggle. Extremist Khalq faction versus the more moderate Parcham.
Division on top of an already fragile situation.
Right, and then the Soviets invade in '79.
Big turning point.
The Soviets, hesitant at first, but things spiraled. They feel they have to act, afraid of losing influence, seeing a pro-Western government. So in they go.
So instead of finding their own path, Afghanistan becomes a battleground.
Tragically, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where the rug merchant's story gets interesting again. He talks about Kabul under the Soviets, under President Babur Karmal, as peaceful, even some economic growth. Social modernization, secularization continue, but it's all built on military spending. Fragile peace.
It makes you wonder, what if Afghanistan had gone with this Soviet-style modernization? Could it have worked?
Fascinating question. But history had other plans. The Soviet withdrawal in '89, well, it ushered in an even more devastating chapter for Afghanistan.
The rug merchant actually says things were more peaceful under Soviet occupation than the freedom fighters who came after.
Wow. Makes you think about unintended consequences, the brutality of war.
So the Soviets leave, and things get worse.
Enough.
Better.
Yeah, it's tragic. Total power vacuum.
Wow.
Nation in ruins. And people, they're desperate for some kind of peace, order. That's where the Taliban comes in.
The Taliban?
In the mid-90s. Backed by Pakistan. fueled by Wahhabism. It's a very strict interpretation of Islam. And get this, for a lot of Afghans who were just tired of war, the Taliban seemed like hope.
Hold on, really?
Yes.
Weren't they? I mean, the bad guys.
They promised to restore order, impose Islamic law, end the chaos. And at first they did, kind of, but at a huge cost. Individual liberties gone, especially for women. Theocratic regime reversing all that progress.
Be careful what you wish for, huh? But I have a question. The U.S. was all in on supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviets, so why abandon Afghanistan after the Soviets left? Like, mission accomplished, Cold War's over, we're out.
Right, that's a huge point. This lack of commitment from the international community, especially the U.S., it's central to understanding what happened. This pattern, you see it again and again, interest and support during a crisis, then poof, they're gone. And the long-term consequences can be devastating.
So big picture, what are the takeaways from Afghanistan's story? What are the lessons here?
Well, the author points to a few things. First, becoming a pawn in a global power struggle, that's dangerous. Afghanistan's location, it made them vulnerable to being used by bigger, more powerful players.
Stuck in the middle, trying to navigate a world they can't control.
Right. And that leads to the second takeaway, balancing reform and tradition. Remember King Amanullah Khan, pushing change too quickly, not thinking about deep-rooted culture. Those norms can lead to pushback and make things unstable.
Finding that sweet spot. Progress, but not losing your identity. Not easy.
And then there's the third lesson. International support. You need it. Especially if you're dealing with poverty, conflict. Modernization needs real help from the global community. But like we saw in Afghanistan, that support is shaky at best, tied to politics. And it usually doesn't last.
So what about the rest of us? What can we learn from all this? Are these just lessons for Afghanistan?
That's where it gets interesting. The book ends by talking about China. They're a rising power, big ambitions for development, and their leaders know about these pitfalls, these challenges.
They're looking at Afghanistan as a warning.
You could say that. The author emphasizes not becoming isolated, maintaining open trade, learning from mistakes, the mistakes others have made. He doesn't say what will happen to China, but the message is clear. To handle global politics and economics, you need wisdom, foresight, and you have to be willing to adapt, to learn.
And that brings us to a bigger question. If Afghanistan's story is a warning, are there countries that have done this right, modernized successfully?
And that's exactly what we'll look at in the next part of our deep dive, another case study. But this one offers a different perspective on the challenges and possibilities of modernization.
Back again for our deep dive into the lost world. We've seen how modernization went so wrong in Afghanistan. We've explored India's journey, all those ups and downs. Now let's switch it up. A country the author considers a success story, South Korea.
South Korea.
Yep.
Fascinating. They show how a nation can go through so much adversity yet achieve amazing progress. Economically, socially. Remember the 4 pillars. South Korea built all 4, even with the odds stacked against them.
Remind me, what were they dealing with?
Okay, so the Korean War, 1950s. Devastation. Country divided. Their economy in shambles. They were relying on foreign aid. Not exactly a great start.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Sounds like they were worse off than Afghanistan and India at the beginning.
They were. But here's the thing. South Korea's leadership, they were determined. They went with an export-oriented growth strategy, shipbuilding, electronics, cars, and they put a lot into education and technology.
Focus on a competitive economy.
Exactly. And it worked. In a few decades, South Korea went from one of the poorest countries to an economic powerhouse globally.
That's incredible. But economic growth, it's not everything, right? What about political freedom, social modernization? I thought South Korea started as a military dictatorship.
True. Their early years, yeah, authoritarian rule. But even then, they made progress. Education, women's rights. And as the economy grew, so did the demand for political freedom.
So they transitioned to a democracy.
Yep. Late 1980s, peaceful transition, multi-party democracy, a turning point showing that economic development and political freedom, they can go together.
It's inspiring, but you can't talk about South Korea without mentioning the U.S. They were very involved in the Korean War and gave a lot of support afterward.
Absolutely. The U.S., a crucial role in South Korea's development, military and economic support. It highlights how the global scene, it can really impact a nation's trajectory.
So we've got Afghanistan, modernization failed. India, it's complicated. And South Korea, success.
Big picture. What should we take away from all this?
The main message. Modernization, it's not a given. It's complex, no guarantees. You need good leadership, smart strategies, learning from others, and sometimes Yeah, a little luck helps.
And it's not just about copying the West.
Right. One size doesn't fit all. What worked in South Korea, it might not work somewhere else. The key is understanding those unique challenges, the opportunities, and tailoring your strategies.
So where do we go from here? What's the final takeaway for our listeners?
We've looked at why modernization fails. Now we shift focus. Those who succeeded, what can we learn from them? How do those lessons apply today, especially for these emerging economies trying to find their place in a world that's getting more complex? A lot to think about. And on that note, we're wrapping up this deep dive. We hope this gave you a new way of looking at the world. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning.